Next up, we have Mozaki, Master Duelist, Mage Legendary. 5 mana 3/8. After you cast a spell, gain spell damage +1. So I've gone back and forth on this card a bit, but I think the more I think about this card, the more I think it's pretty damn good. So there have been some other cards which I thought might reasonably strengthen Mana Cyclone Mage a bit, but this is really like the big payoff finisher thing for Mana Cyclone Mage. It's kind of like Malagos in that it's a super late game finisher. You can go like turn 9, Mozaki, Master Duelist, double Sorcerer's Apprentice, and then you just start spamming stuff that's discounted by Incanter's Flow. You start spamming Ray of Frost and Magic Trick. And I think that late into the game, you can actually get to like spell damage +8 pretty reliably with this card. And spell damage +8's insane. You then just start casting like Arcane Missiles and Frostbolt. Probably a good chance you can even discover more of those with Magic Trick, which you want to be playing on this turn anyway. Arcane Missiles is kind of sketchy, but you can even just like Arcane Explosion to clear their board and make sure it all goes face. I think it's like pretty easy in the late game to just spam a ton of shit with this card and kill your opponent from pretty high life totals. But the thing is, like, yeah, that's kind of like generally if you're evaluating a card and you're saying, you know, turn 9, if you have 2 Sorcerer's Apprentices, you can kill someone with this. That tends to be like a pretty optimistic evaluation of a card. But the thing with this is you don't have to do that. Like, it's going to be similar in application to Malagos pretty often, but it's way more flexible. You can play this on turn 7 with just 1 Sorcerer's Apprentice, or if you've just cast a couple Incanter's Flows this game, you don't even need a Sorcerer's Apprentice necessarily. You can also just stick this on turn 5. It's a frickin' 3/8, and if your opponent lets it live, they're just going to die. And if they don't let it live, then they still had to figure out how to deal 8 damage to a 5-drop. Like, even I feel like this card isn't even that bad against like Demon Hunter, because you just jam it on turn 5 and they have to trade into it or they die. And like the most important aspect of this card is, like, yeah, there are a lot of cards that you can just kind of jam on curve without necessarily getting their effects out of them. But like Cyclone Mage can just win the game without this card anyway, right? They can still play Chinvala, they can still play Mana Giants. So it's just like another win condition for Cyclone Mage. Maybe like the best win condition. I have to imagine that this card, like, I don't want to be playing Priest against Cyclone Mage that can play this card. So it's just like, it just seems so powerful. I don't know. Maybe I'm overestimating how many magic tricks and stuff you can spam in the late game with this. But I feel like it's just going to kill people so often. Man, I like this card. I think this might be good enough to put Cyclone Mage on the map. Next up we have Ace Hunter Kreen, a Demon Hunter / Hunter card. 3 mana 2/4, your other characters are immune while attacking. So the best comparison for this card is going to be Death Speaker, which was 3 mana Battle Cry, give a friendly minion immune this turn. And Death Speaker saw small amounts of play, I believe, in Zoo back in the day. But this card is just better than Death Speaker in like every way. Death Speaker was single target on something for a turn. This is all of your characters, including your hero, for multiple turns. So you can have, what, like a Battle Fiend and a Bone Chewer Brawler in play. You slam this, they both take value trades, and then you still have this whole board. But, like, on top of that, your Ace Hunter Kreen is still in play. So your opponent kind of has to, like, deal with it with a rush minion or a spell or something. Because if they just try to play, you know, Frozen Shadow Weaver into it or something, a 4/3 to contest your 2-power minions, this effect is still in play. So you still just trade your Bone Chewer Brawler and your Battle Mage into the Frozen Shadow Weaver, and then you develop something else, and they still can't play minions into that. So the effect on this card is just insane. Even if you're just like playing this in a Dragon Hunter, a Highlander Hunter, whatever, you go turn 2 Fairy Dragon into this. There are a lot of decks that just can't deal with that, a lot of minion-based decks. And then, of course, it also works with your hero, so it's really strong with the Demon Hunter hero power, or, you know, Twin Slice it's also good with. Maybe Warglaives of Azzinoth make a comeback, probably not. It's good in Hunter, because Hunter can play Diving Griffin. Any other rush cards they have access to are good with this. If you're unfortunate enough to have to play Dino Trader Brand, it's good with that. Tiamat as well, too, I guess. You don't have to pick Divine Shield, you can just take freaking Rush Wind Fury and smack into some shit. It's good with Stormhammer because your weapon and your face don't lose durability. This card is just like... man, this card is good. Now, on its own, it is a 3-mana 2/4. So it's not like always going to be the strongest thing you can play on turn 3. It is a bit situational. But man, I just want this card to be in my deck, even if it's not always live. Like, this card just wins games on its own sometimes. Man, this card is good, I think. Next we have Ceremonial Maul. This is a warrior/paladin weapon. 3-mana 2/2 spell burst. Summon a student with taunt and stats equal to the spell's cost. So if you play this on turn 3 and curve it into a 4-mana spell, you get a 4/4 with taunt, which is pretty nice. This is actually a pretty interesting design, because like most of the spell burst stuff, of course, is on minions. And when you're playing a spell burst minion, like, you don't necessarily have to get the value out of it the turn you play it, but in practice, you kind of need to get the value out of the spell burst card the turn you play it, but not so much with a weapon because it's so much more difficult to interact with weapons. So interesting design on the card. I think the most common application of this would probably be like in Paladin. You play it on turn 3, curve it into Consecration, kill the opponent's Demon Hunter board or whatever, get a 4/4 taunt, and that's pretty strong. But it's like pretty specific to be able to do that. If you don't have the perfect spell to line up with this, it is a 3-mana 2/2 weapon, which is not very good. Of course, we've seen like Ankar and Livewire Lance see play, but those, of course, are always drawing a card or whatever. Another Paladin spell that you can have with it is Blessing of Kings, but how often are you going to have a Blessing of Kings target if you play a 3-mana 2/2 weapon? Probably not super often. Hammer of Wrath is more consistent, but are we putting Hammer of Wrath in our deck? I hope not. And then beyond that, it's starting to look pretty narrow, the applications of the card. Certainly pretty good if we get to land it with one of these 6-cost spells, but are we playing those? Probably the most reasonable thing with this card would be in a Libram Paladin deck. And say we have like a 6-cost Libram of Hope, we also get a 6/6 taunt along with it. But even in a scenario like that, are we overcommitting to the board? Playing a Libram of Hope plus a 6/6 taunt? It's probably pretty reasonable to play exactly both of those, but if we have anything else in play, then it's starting to look like an overcommitment. We also have the issue with this being a weapon. So it's competing with Lightforge Zealot, which is definitely not better than Lightforge Zealot. God, Lightforge Zealot is insane. For 1 more mana, you get this weapon with 2 more attack, and you basically don't even have to spell burst, you just get the minion anyway. God, Lightforge Zealot is an insane card. But more directly, it probably competes with Underlight Angling Rod. And is it better than Angling Rod? It has 1 less attack, which is pretty relevant as a breakpoint. And at least with the way that Pure Paladin is currently built, we really only have Consecration and Libram of Hope as activators. I assume it doesn't work with Libram of Justice because you kill your own weapon, which is very sad. So, kind of a sketchy card in Paladin, I think. It's hard to have an activator for it, and it's competing with other weapons. So, maybe not much of a Paladin card. And realistically, I think it's probably even worse as a warrior card. You can tutor it consistently with Corsair Cache, which is certainly interesting. But it still has to be better than Ankar or Livewire Lance. or even Bulwark of Azzinoth. And I just don't think it's better than those. Plus, Warrior also has the issue that it doesn't really have great activators for this. The best one is obviously going to be Brawl. You clear the opponent's board and get a 5/5 taunt. That is pretty powerful. But outside of Brawl, it seems pretty hard to take advantage of this. Honestly, Shield Block is probably like the second best thing. Maybe Blade Storm. And at that point, 3/3 taunt is... I mean, it's fine. But, I just don't think it's good enough. It does seem that they are potentially pushing a Dimensional Ripper deck, and obviously getting a 10/10 with taunt off this is pretty insane. But at that point you're putting 3 threats in play at the same time, and I think that's even a bit of an overcommitment. Like, that board still just dies to Soul Mirror or whatever. So, as much as I like Ceremonial Maul as a card, and as much as I do think that the power level of the card is high, I think with the current card pool at least, it just doesn't really have a home or good enough activators, which is sad. Next we have Totem Goliath. 5 mana, 4/5 totem. Death Rattle, summon all 4 basic totems, and it has Overload 2. I assume the Overload is not part of the Death Rattle, that'd be weird. So I assume you play this on turn 5, and only have 4 mana on turn 6. Well, Totem Shaman is already a deck, but looking at Totem Shaman, it caps out at Bloodlust at 5 mana. Splitting Axe is the only 4 mana card, so 26 of the cards cost 3 mana or less. Which makes it feel like a 5-drop with Death Rattle is pretty slow for this deck. But in this deck, like, if you hit your synergies with it, it is pretty nuts. Like, your opponent doesn't necessarily want to pop the Death Rattle, because that gives you a bunch of totems that you can buff with Totemic Surge or Storm's Wrath, or depending on the turn, even Bloodlust. It is kind of awkward that this overloads you, so you can't play this on turn 5 and then Bloodlust on 6. But if it's any later than that, Bloodlust is a threat, of course. So they don't necessarily want to be popping the Death Rattle, but if they don't pop the Death Rattle, this thing itself is a totem. So you can Splitting Axe it, you can Totemic Reflection it, which is a pretty insane amount of value, and a pretty good amount of threats in this type of aggro deck. And you don't necessarily have to build Totem Shaman this aggressive. We're playing like 10 1-drops, so we can cut some Blazing Battle Mages to put this thing in. Another card I've been thinking about is Cumulo Maximus. This Totem Goliath also has Overload, but mostly Cumulo Maximus is pretty insane with Lightning Bloom, the new Innervate thing that overloads you. So like maybe that goes in this deck, and you cut, I don't know, cut your Aug Merchants and Battle Mage to put a couple 5-drops in the deck, slow the deck down a little bit. Maybe that could be pretty reasonable. But I'm definitely worried about how slow this card is. And on top of being slow, I think it's also pretty likely that you have too much stuff in play to get the full Death Rattle out of this. Like, if you have more than 3 minions in play, you're not going to get all 4 totems, because you can only have 7 things in play at a time, right? So, that's a pretty sketchy aspect of the card too. I do like this card a lot. I'm actually surprised it took so long to print something that just gives you all the totems. But I think it's kind of slow. And I think outside of Totem Shaman, like, the totems just aren't that good unless you're playing dedicated totem synergies. So I don't think, like, Control Shaman is going to play this card. Interesting card, but we'll have to see if it makes the cut. Oh boy, next up we have Glide. It's a Demon Hunter card. It costs 4 mana. Shuffle your hand into your deck, draw 4 cards, outcast, your opponent does the same. Well, it's certainly true that if you have 0 cards in hand and your opponent has 10, this card is nuts. Draw 4, make your opponent discard 6. Strongest card ever printed, sure. But in practice, you don't always have 0 cards in your hand, and your opponent doesn't always have 10 cards in their hand. So, I think this card is maybe not quite as good as some people seem to think. I think most realistically, like even as Demon Hunter, it seems pretty common to have 2 or 3 cards in hand, even if you're playing pretty aggressively. A lot of times you're holding on to like a Glavebound Adept that you can't play yet, or you're holding on to a Cane, an Altruist, a Twin Slice or Second Slice that you're looking for an opportunity to use, and you don't necessarily want to be shuffling those into your deck. And realistically, I would say, well, if you're drawing 2 cards with this, 4 mana draw 2 is pretty shitty. Even if you're drawing 3, 4 mana draw 3 is like good. 4 mana draw 3 is good. But is it insane? I don't really think so. I'm not even convinced that 4 mana draw 4 is insane. Because, like, Demon Hunter's aggressive. And when you're aggressive, spending that much mana to draw cards is not that great. And as Demon Hunter, we can already play Skull of Gul'dan. Yeah, it's 2 more mana, but is it 2 more mana? Because you reduced all the stuff you draw. So as long as you're getting 2 discounts off this, which since this deck currently plays 0/0 cost cards, you're always getting at least 3 mana back from this. So in a sense, Skull of Gul'dan is cheaper than Glide. And like, yeah, Glide can come out before turn 6, but you're never actually playing this card on turn 4, I think. So I don't think that really matters that much. And on top of Skull of Gul'dan, we also have access to Spectral Sight. And I'm not actually convinced that Glide is even better than this card. 4 mana draw 4 versus 2 mana draw 2. I mean, it kind of depends what deck you're playing, which one of those effects is better. I think in an aggro deck, I'd rather have 2 mana draw 2. Because then, if I'm playing that on like turn 5 or whatever, I can just go ahead and play the cards I draw into. So, I am not that excited about Glide. I think it's definitely worse than Skull of Gul'dan, and I think it might be worse than Spectral Sight, which this list right here isn't even playing Spectral Sight. Now, it does also have the Outcast effect, obviously, which is one of the things that people are, you know, not looking forward to that much. And, I mean, I get it. Having your opponent mess with your hand is, like, pretty sad. You can't do your stupid Malagos combo or whatever. But, like, Demon Hunter already has one of the best anti-combo cards in the game. It's called Battle Fiend. You play it on turn 1 and murder your opponent with it before they can pull off their combo. So, I don't think any Demon Hunter is, like, playing Glide specifically as a tech card to deal with an opponent's combo or the control deck gaining value. Like, as a control deck, you're not hoarding cards and trying to outvalue Demon Hunter. You're playing your board clear as soon as it's available, you're playing your healing as soon as you can, because you're gonna fucking die if you don't. So, against Demon Hunter, control decks, they have what, like 5 or 6 cards in their hand? And Glide is gonna make them draw down to 4, and then they draw a card for their turn anyway. I just don't think it's that impactful. And it's not like this comes out before your opponent can brawl you. Like, maybe you can play this on turn 7 going into Soul Mirror. But I really just don't think there are that many sort of board clears or anything that this really disrupts. And I don't think slow decks are holding cards against Demon Hunter. I think Demon Hunter already has card draw. And I haven't even gotten into playing this card against other aggro decks. Because if you play this against another aggro deck, you might make them draw cards. So, I think this card's pretty overrated. I'm not sure how, like, other reviewers are evaluating this card, but I know that the Hearthstone subreddit was pretty up in arms about this. And I think it's just not that good. Of course, I do have a history of underrating card draw cards. I did give Skull of Gul'dan 4 stars, I will say that. I knew this card would be good. But, what's the Hunter card called? Master's Call is a card that I didn't think would be that good, and it ended up being pretty insane. Raiding Party is another card that I underrated that ended up being pretty insane. But those cards are kind of just fundamentally different from Glide. They tend to draw you into combos, like Weapon plus 0 mana thing you can play immediately, or Spring Paw plus Hyena to make a big threat. Glide really doesn't do that. But probably the most comparable thing to Glide is Divine Favor. And I know a lot of people hate Divine Favor, but this card never... Like, I'm not going to say it wasn't a good card, but I always thought Divine Favor was pretty overrated as well. Like, I'm not saying it shouldn't have been in Paladin decks, but I don't think it was the best card in most of those decks. And I think Glide is definitely considerably worse than Divine Favor. For one, I think the mana cost difference on it is pretty significant. You could draw with Divine Favor when you already had a couple situational cards in your hand. And just in general, like, these can both be 10-card swings. Glide is you draw 4, your opponent discards 6. Divine Favor is draw 10. But, like, if your opponent is a deck with a lot of cards, their limitation is mana and not cards. So they're usually playing like 1 card a turn. And as an aggro deck, you can spam a bunch of 1 and 2 drops. So basically, comparing these cards, drawing a card as aggro is better than making a control opponent discard a card. So Divine Favor is just a better effect than Glide. But anyway, that's a lot to talk about this card. I think it's overrated. I actually think it probably won't see that much play. But I said that about Demon Hunter cards last expansion that ended up getting nerfed, so fuck do I know. And I think this is the last card for today, Felosophy. A 1-mana Warlock / Demon Hunter card. Copy the lowest cost demon in your hand. Outcast, give both +1/+1. So it's a pretty good little value thing. Copying your, going like turn 1, copy your Battle Fiend, and then turn 2, play 2/3 Battle Fiends. Definitely seems pretty strong. But if we look at this current build of Demon Hunter, the only demons we're playing are the Battle Fiends and the Satyr Overseers. And with only 4 targets, I definitely think Felosophy is going to be too situational to include in the deck. And if we look at the demons, I guess typing demon doesn't really do much because Demon Hunter cards are Demon Hunter cards. But yeah, if we just look at what's available in Demon Hunter, it's kind of hard to add more demons. Like maybe Shadowhoof Slayer is a card we could afford to add. Maybe Sightless Watcher. I guess Netherwalker kind of counts. Maybe Priestess of Fury comes back in the deck. But we're kind of stretching to add demons. And it's like, I don't think this card is good enough that I'm taking the inconsistency for it when I only want to be playing like 4 demons anyway. Like, I don't want to add an extra 4 demons that I wouldn't otherwise play just to enable Felosophy. So, I'm not that high on this card in Demon Hunter. Of course, it depends on what new demons we get. If we get like another 1-drop demon for Demon Hunter and like a solid 2-drop demon, and then at that point all we have to force is Sightless Watchers, then alright, maybe we're talking on Felosophy. But like even then, I think you do need to outcast this card for it to be worth it. Like 1 mana draw a Battle Fiend is just not that powerful. So I think it needs to be 1 mana draw a card plus, that old Warlock card Soul Infusion that gave something +2/+2. I think it needs to be, I think you need to be hitting the outcast for this to be usable. And like that's another problem with it. If you're just jamming it into this sort of curve, your Felosophy is going to be getting blocked by Glavebound Adept and Skull of Gul'dan pretty often. Even if you don't want to play like a particular 2-drop on a certain turn or whatever, you're kind of forced to if you want to get the Felosophy out. And I don't think the payoff for this is nearly as big as like a Skull of Gul'dan or whatever. Which is Skull actually the only outcast card that currently sees play? Oh, that's interesting. But yeah, I just don't think... So I think this card is pretty situational in Demon Hunter, at least, basically. I think it's probably a little bit more reasonable in Zoo. Voidwalker is a pretty insane target. You can, of course, play Flame Imp. So we have multiple demons we can be hitting in the early game with it. I guess Fiendish Servant as well. Although with Fiendish Servant, I don't know, it's like we need to have this specific 2-card combo, we need to outcast with it, and then the payoff is that we get to play 2 Bloodfen Raptors instead of just Fiendish Servant into a 2-drop or whatever. Like, I'm not even sure that when you land the payoff on this card that it's always going to be that much better than just playing like 1-drop into 2-drop or whatever. And again, even though Zoo has access to more demons, they currently at least don't even really play that many demons. Play like Nightshade Matron. Probably the most interesting with this is Scrap Imp. Not necessarily because of the stats, but because you can get a second copy of Imprisoned Scrap Imp, which is, you know, pretty insane. Scrap Imp, I'm not sure if it still is after the nerf, but before the nerf it was by far the best card in the deck, so getting another copy of it was pretty good. Also, compared to Demon Hunter, if we're playing this Hand of Gul'dan package, which I assume any Zoo deck will still be playing this, it's like less of a bad thing to have a situational card like Felosophy, and it's more likely that we can be drawing into our demons, so I think the card is less inconsistent in Warlock than it tended to be in Demon Hunter, although Hand of Gul'dan and Nightshade Matron are also big expensive things that can block the Outcast, and I do think you still need to be hitting the Outcast. So it's still a bit awkward. And like, as much as I've been talking about this card, you know, turn 1 into double 4/3 Flame Imp is pretty insane, I do think it falls off pretty hard in the late game. Like I was saying, you can hit it consistently because of Hand of Gul'dan, but if you have other cards in your hand, you like don't really need an effect like this as much. And if you're like turn 6 double Flame Imp with this, like, cool, you jammed 2 Flame Imps on turn 6. And now I play, you know, Praise Netherwing or whatever to just clear your board. So, I don't know. Sketchy card. Has a couple conditionals on it. I don't think it's that good past the early game. So, I don't know. The nuts with it are pretty good, but I don't think the card is going to end up being that great, I would say. Especially when Zoo already needs to be forcing so many other synergies, I think. Of course, this doesn't have to be an aggro card. If you have like some high value demon you want a second copy of, that is possible. Oh, I guess maybe Jumbo Imp is actually kind of interesting because I think it keeps the discount when you copy it, right? That could be cute. But like, other than that, what are you copying? An Aranasi Broodmother? Not that exciting. So yeah, I don't think I'm super impressed by this card, at least not with the current card pool of demons. If there was like some Demon Hunter or some Zoo that played like 20 demons, this would be a lot better. But I don't think that's where we're at with it right now.